My name is Lauren, and I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in 2016, and I've been sharing for years now on this channel about what it's like to live with an illness like schizoaffective disorder. However, over the last year, since about December 2023, I've been sharing extensively about using metabolic therapy, specifically ketogenic therapy, to treat and ultimately heal my experience of my mental illness. I no longer experience any symptoms of my mental illness, and I am completely off of psychiatric medications that I had been taking for over a decade. I've been sharing all of this though in real time as I go through it, and so a lot of the information about what I've been doing and what ultimately has led to me being able to put my illness into remission is kind of dispersed throughout various videos. And so I thought it would be helpful to have it all condensed into one cohesive video where I share exactly what I did in terms of implementing metabolic therapies. Now, I'm going to be sharing what I ultimately used kind of as a medical intervention for myself, but I want to clarify that this is absolutely not medical advice, and I urge you to consult with your own healthcare team before implementing any of the strategies that I'm going to talk about in this video. I worked closely with my own care team, and having medical supervision through it all was really important. All right, so before I even started this process of using metabolic therapies, the first step that I did was to build a care team. And what I initially had wanted to do was find a specialized metabolic psychiatrist or a psychiatrist who was a bit more versed in metabolic health. But I could not find that in my area, and there was difficulties with being treated by a psychiatrist in a different area. And so ultimately, I could not find a specialist like that and had to go forward with my existing psychiatrist and care team. But what was kind of critical for me in terms of adding to my care team was adding a specialist and a keto coach. So I got connected with Nicole Laurent. She is a wonderful licensed therapist with additional training in nutritional and metabolic therapies specifically for mental health. And I get a lot of people asking me how to find these kinds of keto coaches in their area, but something that's important to note is that Nicole lives in a different country than me, but that was never really a problem because we could meet virtually. And so, I was able to access her even from a long distance away. And so adding a keto coach like Nicole was really great in terms of being able to then liaise information with the rest of my existing care team, which consisted of my psychiatrist, my GP, and my therapist. And now, being perfectly honest here, my care team didn't know a lot about metabolic therapies and even was pretty skeptical at various points. And so there was inherently a lot of self-advocacy that needed to occur. But ultimately, it was really helpful to have that medical oversight while navigating this all as well. All right, so in terms of actually implementing metabolic therapies, I'm going to start with talking about the ketogenic diet because that really was the basis or the foundation for the implementation of all of the other different metabolic therapies as well. So essentially, ketogenic therapy is really any diet that allows your body to get into a state of ketosis. And what you're primarily looking at when you're figuring out what exactly you need to eat to be able to get into this state is you're looking at the breakdown of macronutrients. So fat, protein, and carbohydrates. This is really something I never paid much attention to before getting into using ketogenic therapy. But it was really important to hit specific targets or ratios of these different macronutrients. And so the probably biggest one that I focused on initially was keeping my net carbohydrate intake below 20 grams a day. And what I mean by net carbohydrates is the amount of carbohydrates minus grams of fiber or sugar alcohols. And so while keeping my carbohydrate intake down to below 20 grams a day, I also worked on keeping my ratio of fat to protein and carbohydrates combined to a specific amount. And this actually changed a little bit throughout this process. When I first started, I was able to do a 1.5 to 1 ratio, which meant that I had a 1.5 ratio of fat to 1 protein and carb combined. But at various points, I did have to up this just in terms of being able to increase my ketone production and deal with if I was experiencing withdrawal symptoms or stuff like that, to as high as I think I got up to a ratio of 2.5 fat to 1 protein and carbs. I'm currently probably around a 2 to 1 ratio. So I totally get if this is already sounding too complicated, and it was really overwhelming at first to think about this at every single meal and every time I ate something. But Nicole was really helpful in terms of calculating my specific macro ratios that I needed to hit at each meal. And I used an app called Chronometer where I could track all of my food and it would give me the breakdown of my nutrient or my macronutrients at every meal and every day. And that was really, really helpful in terms of kind of learning how to eat in this way. And if you don't have access to a keto coach who can help you figure out your own specific macronutrient targets, there are online calculators that you can use to figure this out as well. Basically, though, you're hitting high fat, but still a specific amount, not going too far over that, moderate protein, and very low carbohydrates, typically under 20 grams a day. These targets kind of fluctuated too for me a little bit depending on how physically active I was. If I was more active, I did need to increase my fat and also my protein a little bit. But I do think that some people make the mistake of eating too much protein sometimes, and that can offset the ratios, and lead to lower ketone levels. So I've already talked about how I tracked and broke down the macros for every food I ate. And so it became really, really important to be looking very closely at the nutrition labels of all of the foods that I consumed. I also made sure to really steer clear as much as possible from any processed foods. And I really leaned more towards whole foods and avoided things like gluten and wheat. And unfortunately, also most of the packaged or marketed as keto snacks, because oftentimes they contained stuff like gluten and grains and this kind of stuff, or were just really, really processed too. Shifting your diet probably away from a standard American diet and more towards this kind of well-formulated ketogenic diet can be a really big shift, and it definitely was for me too. But doing things like cleaning out our pantry and making it as easy as possible, stocking up on staple keto items and whatnot, and doing more digging into recipes that we could go to easily was really, really helpful. And again, I mentioned that I tracked everything I ate for probably several months. And while yes, that was quite tedious and it's not exactly the easiest thing to do, it was really, really crucial in terms of being able to fully understand and learn, what kinds of foods I should be eating, and also be able to get insight into what my ketone levels were in relation to what I ate and what the macronutrient breakdowns were. It was just really valuable insight that I could build and gain from tracking my food and measuring my ketones. And so just a little bit more about what switching to this diet looked like. We definitely tried to use fats really strategically. So every time we cook something, it's cooked in olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, butter, ghee, duck fat, beef tallow, all these kinds of healthy fats that are nice to add to any meal. We often also had to just find additional fat sources to add to meals, especially because a lot of recipes online are not necessarily medical keto. They're typically more weight loss keto. And so they are more high in protein and not necessarily as high in fat. And so I think I add a half of avocado to almost every single meal I eat, or cream or cheeses, or, adding fat wherever I can. In the beginning, making the switch towards keto was also easier by, swapping out stuff that we ate a lot or regularly for kind of keto options. So before keto, we ate a lot of wraps for lunches. And so what we did was we started out with eating lettuce wraps for lunches with meat and mayo and avocado. And that was kind of a easier transition where we're still eating similar foods, but taking away the heavy carbs in that meal. Things like fat bombs also really help to increase our fat intake and also kind of curb maybe carb or sweet cravings by adding things like erythritol or allulose or monk fruit. Those are sugar alcohol options. But that said, pretty quickly into transitioning to keto and becoming fat adapted, my cravings for carbs and sweet things basically dropped off the charts. Like, I really don't crave those things anymore. And I think it largely is because my body is now craving and wanting fats, because that is what it ultimately is running off of. And then just one more thing about the nutrition component is supplementation. That was really important. It's something that we didn't do the first time, and it resulted in a really difficult experience, I think, particularly around the keto flu. So especially in the early stages of switching to keto, it's really important to supplement things like electrolytes. So sodium, potassium, magnesium. Nicole was really, really helpful in terms of figuring out which supplements I needed to take. But basically, at a minimum, I think when you're making this transition, you need to be taking magnesium, potassium. Acetyl L-carnitine was very, very helpful for me, and a good multivitamin as well. Some other things that I've also been taking are vitamin D. I live very far north, and so don't get a lot of sunlight. Omega-3, NAC, what does that stand for? N-acetylcysteine, and glycine in conjunction with that. And then Throughout this whole year, I've also been taking electrolytes mixed in with water every day. I don't know if you really need to beyond a certain point, but I find it helpful, especially doing a lot of physical activity and sweating a lot. So I started with the low carb options from, I've heard people pronounce this differently. Some people say LMNT, some people say element. I think it's element. But then I found another option called Relight. I don't know if it's just available in Canada, but allegedly it is 0 carbs and it's like marginally cheaper. All right, so now I'm going to move into tracking and measuring ketones. So I guess first off, what are ketones? So I've talked about the point of a keto diet being to get your body into a state of ketosis. And what this essentially means is that your body is now burning fat for fuel and producing something called ketones, which essentially is what your brain and body start to run off of, instead of what it usually does in terms of using glucose as a fuel source. And so measuring and tracking your ketone levels is a really great way to build insight into what kind of therapeutic benefit you're getting from using ketogenic therapy. I did a whole video going over what ketone levels feel best for me and kind of where expert guidance is around this. But again, Dr. Christopher Palmer recommends hitting at least 1.5 millimoles per liter of ketone levels every few days to be achieving therapeutic benefits. But for me, again, this needed to be actually quite a bit higher in the beginning. And again, being able to cross-reference these ketone levels through monitoring with what kind of macronutrients you're intaking through your food tracking and whatnot is really beneficial to, again, providing insight into how to make adjustments to increase the ketone levels if that's what your brain and body are needing. So we went totally overboard on different kinds of monitors, really for the sake of testing them out as this kind of public one-person experiment going through this. So we tested everything from breathalyzers to the Keto Mojo blood meter. We used the SciBio continuous ketone monitors, or CKMs, and we briefly tested urine strips as well. But the ones that we primarily used were the Keto Mojo blood monitor, which gave a ketone reading and a glucose reading, which then also combines to give you a GKI score, which was another metric that was helpful. And we've also used the continuous ketone monitors basically this whole time as well. The CKMs have been wildly helpful in terms of giving a reading. I think it's every 4 or 5 minutes. And so over the span of 2 weeks. And so it's really, really helpful to get really instantaneous data about what your ketones are doing and then be able to relate back, well, what caused this increase or dip? Things like what I'm eating or exercise or, various different aspects. And yeah, again, just a really helpful tool to build insight into what was ultimately going to benefit me the most. I think that a lot of people maybe scoff at all of this monitoring and tracking that is involved in all of this. And I get it. It's cumbersome and a little bit tedious, but really the empowerment that I derived from gaining this insight into ultimately what factors are going to improve my health the most was really, really good for me. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the other metabolic therapies that I implemented over the last year. So the first one being sleep and circadian rhythm. And I will absolutely admit that this one was the most difficult for me. I've kind of always struggled with sleep. I think, getting to bed at the right time every day has always been a challenge for me. I don't really like going to bed. And I don't know, as a parent, nighttime kind of feels like my time. And so that was hard to give up in terms of going to bed earlier. But it is something I had been working on throughout the last year. And not just bedtimes, but just improving overall sleep quality. So what I did to improve my sleep environment in this sense was made sure that I was sleeping in a cool, dark room. We actually invested in an 8-sleep mattress cover, which is something that cools both sides of the bed so that me and Rob could have different temperatures of mattress depending on our needs. I don't know, that seems a little bit ridiculous, but I can't tell you enough how big of an impact it actually had on our sleep quality. I think especially in the summer when it's hotter, being able to stay cool throughout the night really improved the quality of both mine and Rob's sleep. And now totally understand that the 8-sleep in particular is wildly pricey and probably out of reach for most people. But it's interesting that stuff like that really does have a profound effect on sleep quality and thus on circadian rhythm and metabolic health. Some other kind of lifestyle adjustments I made to improve my sleep quality and circadian rhythm were to limit my caffeine intake, my coffee intake, to 1 to 2 cups at most and before noon. So trying to really stay away from any caffeine intake after noon. Exercising and movement earlier in the day, trying to stay away from late night exercise. But I don't know, Rob and I have like late night soccer games every week lately, and it's interesting to gain insight into how disruptive that can be. So trying to get exercise earlier in the day if possible. Trying to really cut down on screen time in the hours leading up to bed, and also avoiding eating and trying to avoid drinking before bed too. I really like a cup of decaf before bed though, and so I still sometimes do that or snack it out after a late soccer game. So not perfect on this front, but really trying to make positive strides in the right direction in terms of regulating my circadian rhythm and improving sleep quality as a metabolic therapy. And now again, tracking devices were again really empowering in terms of having insight into what affected my sleep both positively and negatively. So what I used at various points throughout the last year were different devices such as 8Sleep, which does some sleep tracking. I wore a Whoop wristband for most of the year. I have my Garmin watch, which also tracks sleep, and I've lately transitioned to an Oura ring. And so these were all ways that I could measure my sleep quality, things like my HRV, and other metrics, resting heart rate, all these kinds of things. And again, it was just kind of an empowering way to take more ownership over improving my sleep as a metabolic health intervention. The next metabolic therapy that I used was exercise and movement specifically. So running has always been a big part of my life, and it's definitely something that I have done a lot of. And I think it probably really actually benefited me even before I got focused on implementing metabolic therapies, probably from a perspective of actually marginally improving my metabolic health. So I run probably 5 to 6 times a week, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes maybe a bit more, integrating different kinds of runs, such as easy pace runs, intervals, so doing more sprints and kind of stuff to improve my VO2 max, trail running, just kind of trying to switch it up in that regard. Again, I've really found that running has always really benefited me both physically and mentally. I've also tried to implement more strength as well as different kinds of cross training, so doing weight training. I started doing a bit of swimming, cycling, yoga. I shared that I trained and raced in a triathlon earlier in the year, which was just kind of a way to keep physical activity exciting and a little bit more varied. It also was nice to work toward a goal. But I've mentioned in previous videos that it's really not just about focused exercise. Exercise and physical activity as a metabolic therapy is probably better described as just kind of general movement. And so making sure that you are engaging your body throughout the day in a more regular way. And so ways that I really focused on doing this was trying to walk more, playing with my kids, just getting physical activity like that, household chores, moving around the house, kind of anything that helped to stay a bit more active and less sedentary throughout the day. And now endurance running was something that I did a lot of before keto. I had raced a marathon the year before and an ultra marathon on the trails, and that's been a really, big part of my passion. But I did find over the last year of using ketogenic therapy that I wasn't quite able to have the same capacity for more prolonged efforts. And part of why I didn't really explore that too much was because I really did just want to focus on healing my mental illness and working on getting down and off of my psychiatric medications. And that was really the priority, and finding stability within that. But now that I'm kind of definitely in a stable place, I am wanting to explore that more from a more physical performance perspective. Okay, now the next metabolic therapy was abstaining from drugs and alcohol. And I think that this is one that is probably not talked about enough in terms of really understanding how metabolically damaging consuming substances like alcohol or other various drugs can be. And I think part of this is just that it's really normalized at a societal level, going out with friends for drinks, or alcohol as being a really big part of a lot of different kinds of social engagements. And I really did not do drugs very much, but I have shared in the past on this channel about experimenting with weed and even with mushrooms. And I shared in those videos that they had really, really negative effects on my mental health. And so I did understand really that this was going to be important. And so in December of 2023, when we started this, I completely cut out all alcohol and drugs. I think it was something that I realized quite quickly had a really positive impact on my mental health and just kind of general overall health. It became really obvious to me that this is an important thing to be really mindful of, and that the ways we consume this or how it's been normalized are really not in line with really taking care of our health and well-being. And to clarify, and for full transparency here, I completely abstained from alcohol for the first 6-7 months. And on my birthday, I allowed myself to have a small glass of red wine. And that was kind of the first time I had had it again. And I've had it maybe a couple times here and there since. But in those instances, I can tell almost immediately that it just does not have a good effect on my mental health and my physical health. And so I still completely understand that it's not something that I really want to get back into, and that it is a really important component of maintaining my metabolic and mental health. And now another one that could be lumped into this drugs and alcohol category is caffeine. And I think I'm still not in a place where I'm quite ready to give it up, but I am trying to be more mindful of when I consume it, how much, more moderation. But I think it is a future goal to give that up as well, because I think I do understand that that doesn't have the greatest effects on various aspects of my health and mental health as well. The next thing I want to talk about, which ended up being kind of an unanticipated big part of the last year of implementing metabolic therapies, is medication tapering. This is something that I didn't plan to do at all. But I think it was about 3 weeks into using ketogenic therapy, I started to experience really intense side effects of my medication. I didn't know that was what it was in the beginning, and I just thought I was all of a sudden really sedated and just really blunted again. I couldn't get out of bed. But Nicole informed me about something called potentiation. And what this means is that when you implement two different medical interventions, being medication and ketogenic therapy for me in this instance, they can kind of come together to create a way more potent effect than either of these interventions would individually. And so all of a sudden, when I introduced ketogenic therapy and metabolic therapies, I was on way too strong of a dose of my antipsychotics. And all of a sudden I was experiencing intense side effects of them because I was over-medicated. And so brought this information to my psychiatrist, and we made the decision together to try to reduce my medication to hopefully abate some of this sedation that I was experiencing. And so we dropped an increment, and I immediately felt relief, but was still experiencing a bit of sedation. And so went back to my psychiatrist, and he suggested, okay, let's drop it again. Dropped it again and was great. And so that was really confirming the fact that it was potentiation that I was experiencing. And so that is something that is probably important to know about when trying ketogenic therapy as something that could happen. But this reduction in my medication kind of kickstarted this then 10-month-long journey of slowly tapering off of and reducing my medication. Of course, completely under the guidance and supervision of my care team. I cannot stress that enough. Please do not attempt to adjust your medications on your own. And now I just gave that disclaimer about please do not do this on your own. It is really important to be under medical supervision. But there is another side of that story for me anyway, where my psychiatrist wasn't the most well-versed or trained in deprescribing. And I think that that unfortunately is pretty common in our current psychiatric system. And he actually suggested reducing and tapering down on my antipsychotic quicker than I ended up doing. I decided to go slower than what he was recommending, and I still experienced quite intense withdrawals with these taperings. And so that was a added challenge to all of this that I did not anticipate or plan for. But withdrawal was a really difficult thing to navigate when trying to reduce my medication. And so yes, super important to work with your care team on this, but at the same time, there is going to probably need to be a degree of self-advocacy taking place as well. And so the next section to talk about is additional health tracking. And so again, I did probably go a little bit overboard on this just in the interest of collecting data and information and trying different things out to share what works best in terms of sharing this all publicly on YouTube. throughout the journey. But again, getting insights into my different health metrics and what contributed to feeling good or feeling less good. And yeah, building that insight into my own body and brain and health and well-being was incredibly empowering and a really big component of this process. And then the main app that I used was, like I mentioned, Chronometer, where I could track my macros. And I also used that app to make notes about my mental health, any symptoms that I was experiencing, my mood, all these sorts of things, and just kind of daily observations to kind of keep them all in one place. And again, build up these insights into what ultimately led to feeling the best, both physically and mentally. Another thing that we tracked and monitored was different forms of blood testing. And so it was really, really helpful to have Nicole provide guidance into what types of blood tests we needed to ask our GP for in order to, make sure that we were doing this safely and to get, again, more insight into different kinds of biometrics. And so she gave us a full comprehensive list to bring to our GP, but the main things to ask for were a lipids panel, a metabolic panel, carnitine levels, vitamin D, and stuff like that. It was interesting that I live in Edmonton, Alberta, and I guess in my province, they don't let anyone get vitamin D testing because it's, seen as redundant because they just assume that everyone who lives here is vitamin D deficient. And so had to actually go through a private blood testing company in the States to find out what my vitamin D levels were. Metabolic Mind also has a really helpful list of suggested blood testing to get done if you're implementing ketogenic therapy. I think it's in their resources, but we will link to that in the description below. And then I mentioned that I had been making personal notes about different symptoms I was experiencing, my mood, what my mental health was like within Chronometer. But Nicole also administered specific assessments and testing to kind of see the progression of my mental health. And so these were things like assessing cognitive function and standard testing for things like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And so Nicole administered those to me periodically throughout the last year. And kind of another way to gain more insight into the therapeutic benefits of this intervention. And then the next thing that I want to talk about, which was a really, really big component of I think what allowed me to be successful over the last year in implementing metabolic therapies is having a good support system. And so this really primarily had to do with my husband, Rob, going through this all with me and being incredibly supportive throughout the journey. But I also had other people in my life who were really supportive too. Our kids were actually really, really great at supporting me throughout this journey. I think in the beginning, they didn't quite understand why we had to eat this certain way, but, talking with them and hearing from them, it's been really incredible what they've internalized about what it means to take responsibility and ownership for your own well-being. And I get emotional a little bit thinking about that, but they've been really big sources of support throughout all this as well, cheering me on throughout. And my extended family have been really supportive too. My stepmom has been experimenting with various types of keto meals and wanting to help us throughout that. And I'm really, really fortunate to have had really good support in navigating this. I know that is not always the case for people who are interested in trying this to improve their mental health. And we just released a video that goes more into maybe how to navigate this if you are facing pushback from loved ones, which you can check out here. But not only in my personal life did I have this sense of support, but also we connected with Metabolic Mind, who were incredible in terms of offering support. They're actually the ones who connected me with Nicole Laurent and introduced us. I also met people like Hannah Warren, who we've had on this channel, sharing her experience using metabolic therapies. And it was really, really helpful to connect with people who have gone through similar life changes and changes in their experience of their mental illness as well. It can feel kind of isolating making these big changes, especially if they're going really against norms and if people around you maybe don't understand. And so I really have come to understand how important being able to connect with others who share similar experiences is. And I've always known this. We had a peer support community for people experiencing psychotic spectrum illnesses, and I know how valuable having connection with peers who are navigating similar things can be. And so we actually have a new online peer support community geared specifically for people who are implementing metabolic therapies for their mental illness. So there's a link to that in the description below and in a pinned comment if you're interested in joining that free community. Navigating social situations with a very specific diet and lifestyle that, again, goes against typical norms can also be a little bit, I had a little bit of anxiety in the beginning. And I think honestly, for the first couple months, I just kind of avoided social situations because I didn't want to have to figure out how to navigate that. It felt overwhelming or maybe even a little bit embarrassing, potentially being in a situation where I needed to say, oh, sorry, I'm on medical keto or whatever it may be. But I think with time, I definitely began to feel more confident in understanding that this was a really good choice for me and one that I don't necessarily have to defend or justify really in any situation. And so I think I got more confident navigating those situations in a way that just feels authentic for me. It's okay to just say, oh, no, thank you, if someone offers you something that doesn't fit within your ketogenic diet. That's okay. You don't have to drink to be in social situations. There's different options available. We did a video, which I can link to as well, that kind of goes more in depth into, navigating social situations while following medical ketogenic therapy. And now the next component of this metabolic therapy journey was one that I didn't really come into this understanding as much the importance of in the context of metabolic therapies, but I think it was actually Matt Bazuki who posted a video on his YouTube channel that shared this as kind of a pillar of his approach to metabolic therapies. And that was around purpose and kind of personal reflection as being a really important component of the healing process as well. And so, things like psychotherapy, going to therapy have always been a part of my repertoire and something that I continue to do throughout the last year as well. And obviously I always made videos, but there started to be this element of more personal reflection of what this journey means and maybe actually opening up space for what I want from life. And that has been a perhaps slightly surprising big element of the last year and what this experience has entailed for me. It has been cool to be sharing this in real time in videos because I think that kind of documentation and personal journaling, in a sense, has been therapeutic in terms of helping me to process the experience and also simultaneously to connect with others around these different things that I've been exploring. I think I started this journey in December of 2023 with maybe the limited perspective or understanding of these interventions being able to potentially improve my experience of my mental illness. But it's been interesting and exciting and really fulfilling to actually have it go way, way deeper for me. And perhaps that has to do with the improvements I've had in my mental illness, opening up and creating space for me to explore more intimate components of myself and what I feel it means to be a person in this world. But I think ultimately that has become a really big component of this healing journey as well. So that was probably a long overview of what all I did over the last year, but I think it is important to have this kind of all in one place. What exactly I did, what metabolic therapies I implemented, and what ketogenic therapy looked like for me. So again, just to recap, the main points that were a part of my journey over the last year of doing this were building a care team, medical keto implementation, and doing that from a really regimented perspective and a place that's centering therapeutic benefits, ketone tracking, improving things like sleep and circadian rhythm, consistent movement and exercise, abstaining from substances like alcohol and drugs, and medically supervised medication tapering. And once more, everything I shared here was what I did and what personally worked for me. And I think that there's a lot of people who are hearing me sharing all of this and thinking that I am prescribing this to everyone. But that's really not the point of what I'm trying to communicate by sharing this entire experience. I think that there's a lot of room for people to explore what is ultimately going to work best for them. Maybe that looks similar to what I did, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's something completely different. my point here and what I'm hoping that other people can take away is what I've described as taking a vested interest and developing that sense of empowerment over taking control over my own health and well-being, developing these insights into what ultimately contributes to positive effects for me, both physically and mentally. And I think that that is really what we should collectively be focusing on, is developing and creating that sense of personal empowerment to explore how to live our best lives and how to reach a place of health and well-being that allows for that. So thank you so much to each and every one of you who has followed along throughout this entire journey or at various points. I hope that this video was helpful in terms of providing more information about what exactly my journey with metabolic therapies over the last year has entailed. I'm so bad at this, but please, if you enjoyed this video or other videos of ours, like our videos, comment your own experiences, and make sure to subscribe to our channel to see more. So I've laid out a lot of different lifestyle changes that I've made over the last year in this video, and I know that that can feel really overwhelming to figure out, well, what is going to work best for me, or where do I even begin? And so I am really excited to also share that Metabolic Mind has recently released a new tool that can kind of help guide you in terms of figuring out what different interventions are going to work best for you, and kind of, having a list to kind of choose from. They've called it the Think Smart tool, and we actually have a whole video going more in depth into this, but you can find it on their website, and we'll also link to it in the description below. Again, it's a really cool tool that kind of helps lay out options for you to pick and choose from and figure out, again, what is ultimately going to work best for you in terms of integrating metabolic therapy. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, wishing you and your loved ones good health. We'll see you in the next video. Bye.